Hey Nick,
Hey Liam.
what's the largest ant in the world?
I don't know. What's the largest ant in the world?
A giant.
I mean, it's just ANT. Like, it's just ANT. This is as bad as the antibiotic one.
I got another one.
Oh, go on then.
Hey Nick,
Hey Liam.
what's the wealthiest insect in the world?
I don't know.
The accountant.
Well, as long as you're happy with yourself, then that's all we need, really. Hello and welcome to Antocast, an insect podcast. The podcast sponsored by the Royal Entomological Society, telling you all you ever needed to know and more about insects.
That's right, and regular listeners will know that we have worked our way through previous episodes through different groups. We've had some orders and some groups within orders, and regular listeners will also know that one of our favourite groups of insects is the order Hymenoptera, and we've done episodes on bees and we've done an episode on wasps. However, some people have identified that actually there's a rather big, rather popular group of Hymenoptera which we haven't done, and that is of course the ants. So today we're going to be talking to someone who's done some research on some ants and will hopefully be able to enlighten us with some interesting ants facts and maybe some interesting ant research. And that is the wonderful Dr. Heather Campbell from Harper Adams University.
Of course, so let's go and join Heather now and get ready for some ant bants.
Hello, Heather.
Hi,
How are you?
very good, thank you.
Let's dive straight into it. What is an ant? What are we talking about when we say the word ant?
What is an ant? Well, it's interesting actually that you mentioned if people had to name 5 insects, they would say ant as one of them. Because actually, if you look at words from across the globe and you look at all languages and words that are in common for all languages, in the top 100 words that are shared by all languages across the globe, I think about 5 or 6 of them are animals or plants, and one of those is ant.
Wow.
So ant is universally kind of understood and one of the most common words and commonly recognized things across all language groups and across everywhere on the planet, which I think is a good kind of starting point for saying how important ants are and how much we just see them around all the time.
So do you think that's part of the reason why it is such a ubiquitous term, is because we see them a lot?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think they're just easily identifiable. So maybe with other insects, you don't necessarily know what you're looking at when you see it. Some of them maybe are more distinct, but some are less well known. Whereas if you see an ant, you almost immediately know that it's an ant. They tend to be quite distinctive. And also just the fact that they're basically found everywhere. So whether you're in a temperate environment or in the tropics, whether you're in a jungle or you're just in your house, you see ants everywhere. And so I think that's why ants kind of speak to people and they're something that's immediately recognizable.
So you said they're very instantly recognisable. What is it about an ant that makes it an ant? What is it that makes it an ant and not like a sawfly or something, for example?
Okay, so ants, obviously, Liam already mentioned within the Hymenoptera. They're maybe a little bit different because most of the ants that we see, which tend to be the worker ants, don't have wings. So that often sets them apart. Obviously, some of the ants do have wings, the ones that disperse. So the queens have wings to disperse, and then also the males for mating purposes. But the majority of ants that people will see, when you're walking around and you see an ant, obviously doesn't have any wings. So that already is quite a distinguishing kind of feature of an ant. In terms of other morphological differences, ants have elbowed antennae. So if you're looking at ants, if you were to pick up an ant and look at it under a hand lens or under a microscope, and maybe you weren't sure, is this an ant or, it could be a wasp, maybe something that might look similar to it. If you have a look at the antennae, they have quite a distinct bend, an elbow in the antennae. So that's also a good way to know you're definitely looking at an ant.
And taxonomically, how do we describe ants? Are they, one group, or are there several different things with the same meaning? Like when we were talking about wasps, one of the things we spoke about was how, what is a wasp? We've got parasitic wasps, we've got aculeate wasps, and they're divided. Is that the same with ants, or is it more tangible and unique?
Yeah, so ants sit quite nicely as sort of a well-defined monophyletic group, just being one taxa. So all ants belong to Formicidae, and then within that you have your different ant subfamilies, but ants as a whole are fairly well defined.
So one of the things that we've already kind of touched on is that the ants are just everywhere. It's just if it's just one family, but it is so ubiquitous. What is it that makes ants so successful?
Yeah, so a lot of people have debated why ants have managed to be successful. And that's true for some other groups of invertebrates as well, but ants seem to be particularly good at doing this. So ants in terms of biomass, there's absolutely loads of ants. So in terms of species diversity, ants as a group are not that species rich if you compare them to, say, something like wasps, as you mentioned, sort of parasitoid wasps. So there aren't as many species of ants. There's maybe, we think, sort of between 25,000 ant species currently described. There could be 3 times that number. We don't really know, especially if you go to the tropics. Everything you find is new, so the actual number could be much higher. But relative to some of the other insect groups, like wasps and beetles, it's not that many in terms of different types of species. So the reason that we see lots of ants is actually just because there are so many of them. So in terms of biomass, there are just a lot of ants there. And a lot of the reason for that is because ants obviously live in colonies. So rather than being solitary or being in much smaller groups, because they're in colonies and then they're producing workers, they're able to reach these huge levels of biomass just in terms of numbers.
So there are no solitary ants?
No, so there are some ants, well, there's a couple of different kind of life history strategies, I guess. So some ants are basically social parasites, so they will live inside the nests of other ants. So in that case, you might just get a few of them. I guess that's the closest thing to an ant living on its own, but it's not really living on its own because it's sharing a nest with a different species. And some ants obviously have smaller colony sizes. So there are certain subfamilies of ants where you might get 5 or 20 or 30 individuals. So they're relatively small colonies. Other colonies you can have hundreds of thousands, maybe even up to millions of workers in a colony. So there's quite a lot of variation across different species and different groups of ants in terms of their sort of life history.
And are these workers always like a sterile worker caste, so it's true eusociality, or is there different degrees of sociality?
Yeah, so the workers, so they can't switch basically. So it's not like in other insects. So if you're a worker ant, you can't then become a queen. Don't think I've ever heard of any examples where ants are able to switch. So I don't think that's a kind of a variable trait.
Do we have any idea why they've evolved this strategy to be very eusocial? What is the advantage of this sociality?
So obviously, if you kind of are dividing up your tasks, it will make you much more efficient as a whole. So this is one of the reasons that they think ants are so successful, because they have this social behavior and this colony structure. So it means that because you just have one individual, or maybe just a small number of individuals within a nest that are being reproductive, and then you have your worker ants. So they can go out, they can forage for food, they might be defending the colony, they're tidying up and keeping the nest clean. So everybody else within that colony is just focusing on keeping the colony running, helping feed any offspring that they have. So all of their energy is just going into making the colony successful and growing the size of the colony. And then the queen or queens within the colony that are the sort of reproductive unit, her job is just basically to produce eggs that the workers will then look after. So having that kind of structure means that everyone is given their specific task, I guess, and that's often why they're able to reach these massive colony sizes.
Yeah, it's almost hard not to anthropomorphize them in a way, because it does almost sound like a human society with people doing different tasks and things. I do wonder if that's partly why they are something that's so present in popular culture. You see ants in all sorts of paintings and all things. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this idea of... So some people like to treat ants sort of the colony unit or kind of larger groups of ants as a superorganism. So their argument is that we shouldn't be looking at the level of the individual ant because they're all acting collectively. So, people would say, okay, well, you could think of, the different individual ants as being equivalent to, say, leaves on a tree, perhaps, and then the tree is the whole organism. Whereas with ants, the workers would be equivalent to the leaves, and then the colony, the superorganism, is the whole organism because they're acting completely collectively. So it's an interesting idea that people like to give them, maybe these characteristics, and they pop up in films a lot because actually the ants individually, they're not thinking in the same way as we're thinking. They're not thinking, I have to go out and get food, or, I have to defend the nest from this particular predator. They're just acting. A lot of the control is chemical, and they're acting on a completely different level in terms of their behavior.
Yeah, but you could argue that we are actually doing the same thing, but we just sort of rationalise it. It's like, I'm thinking I need to go to the shops, when actually you're just like, I'm just hungry.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point.
So one of the really cool things I've heard about ants is that there's many examples of particular traits or particular actions that we always considered as humans were unique to us. Mm-hmm. And then as we've learned more about the natural world, we've seen other organisms, there's nothing new. There's always something that does it. And quite a lot of these seem to be done with ants. So one of the ones which really kind of captures my imagination is the idea of farming in a way with another organism. Yeah. And I think there's some pretty good examples in ants.
So one of the reasons that ants are really interesting is because they have all of these interactions with other plants and with animals and with fungi, as I say. So some of them will grow fungi. Lots of them will tend other insects. So things for honeydew, so maybe things like aphids or scale insects. And they will look after those little insects and protect them from being eaten by any predators. And then they will basically feed off the honeydew, which is essentially sort of a waste product for these animals. Yeah, aphid poop. The example that I would give that's particularly interesting, and they actually farm, I think it might also be scale insects, it's some other insect, and they basically farm them for meat, essentially. So when they go and set up a new colony, they will take these insects with them. They have essentially sort of what you could think of as little farms where they're growing these insects, and they're actually eating them. So they're feeding on them for meat. So rather than, so there are lots of examples where the ants are tending insects and then getting the honeydew. And that's obviously not having a big impact on the aphid or the scale insect or whatever it might be. It's just apart from maybe protecting it from predation. So it's this mutualism. Whereas in this other example, they're actually farming these other insects in order to eat them, so to predate on them. But they're not wild, kind of free-roaming insects. They keep them inside their galleries, their little nests that they have. And if they relocate their nest, or if another nest buds off and they start a new one, they'll take them with them and start farming them again. Which, as far as I know, I've never come across anyone else that's been able to give me an example of any other animals, any other creatures actually that do that actually will farm another animal species for meat. So
apart from humans, so
kind of amazing.
Humans and ants,
apart from humans, so
that's crazy. Yeah. Is that still a mutualism? Because although the insects are being eaten, would they be there if the ants weren't looking after them? It's like the idea that actually is corn taking advantage of humans by being grown by us. I mean, it's all over the world now, so it's a kind of fun to think about.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if you're offering yourself up to be predated, if you'd consider that a mutualism. It depends. It's more like sacrifice. I don't know.
But then would you exist if you weren't?
Yeah, it's true. I don't know.
Interesting.
It's really interesting.
Bit philosophical. Being quite present in popular culture, you hear lots of different things and stories about ants. We've already touched on a couple, but one of the ones you always hear when you talk about ants is like, oh yeah, ants are really strong. They can lift 80 times their body weight or something. I don't know if you know, but my question to you is that true? Are they particularly strong, or is it just because they're insects and insects are quite strong and most people don't know that other insects are also as strong, that ants are the example?
I don't know in terms of comparison between different insects if ants are stronger than other insects. I mean, the reason that ants are strong is the reason that all insects are strong. It's because they have exoskeletons and it's the way that they're structured. Yeah, in terms of ants specifically, I'm not sure. There are certain points on ants that are particularly strong, things like their jaws in some of the predatory species, but whether they're genuinely stronger than other insects, I don't know. I think it could just be possibly based on, I don't know, some other ant biologist might kill me for this, I don't know. But I think maybe it's just because people don't know how strong insects are in general, and then an ant, it seems so tiny, so even picking up something that maybe isn't that heavy, but you can say, okay, relative to its body weight, it's ridiculously heavy. And because they carry things around all the time, so the way in which they forage, they go out and collect food, and then they bring something back that seems absolutely enormous, and also you see them clearing out their nest, and again they're clearing out all of this debris, so I think maybe it's just about the it captures people's imagination because it's about that visual of, it's this tiny little ant, and she's carrying whatever it is. But you do have to be careful. So there's quite a few photographs that you see floating around on the internet of ants carrying, these particularly heavy weights and things. And actually some of those are basically kind of Photoshop efforts, or they've kind of mocked up, an ant upside down with a weight hanging on it. And then they flip the image over. So it looks like the ant is then holding it up when actually it was hanging with a weight on it. So you have to take some of these things with a pinch of salt, which is not to say that they're not strong, but not everything you see is real.
Yeah. So we've sort of come at this from the angle, because we are interested in entomology and in insects, that ants are interesting. Mm-hmm. But for a lot of people, ants are pests. When I was doing my research into it, a lot of the things that I was finding is like, how do I get rid of ants? Ants are in my house, what do I do?
Ruining my picnic.
So if we're talking to these sorts of people, like, what would you say is the importance of ants? Why should we look at them? Why should we be interested in them, other than the things that we've already said? Like, what is the interesting thing about ants?
Yeah. I mean, my first argument actually when I talk to people like that is, well, if you're seeing ants all of the time everywhere, you have to ask yourself what they're doing that's so important, and imagine if we took them out of a system, because if you're seeing them constantly, what would happen if you remove them, even if you feel that they're being a pest? So that alone, I would say, generally points to something being kind of important. So I mentioned already, obviously, interactions in terms of ants interacting with different things. So obviously they can be pests either because they're in people's houses, and getting into their sugar bowl. Agriculturally, they can obviously also be considered pests because they'll tend, like I was talking about with these mutualisms, they'll tend insects that are pests on crops. They then cause damage to crops. So that there are some kind of negative impacts, I guess, of ants. The other side of that is that because they're involved in interactions, a lot of those interactions are really positive. So ants can feed in lots of different ways. It could be by tending other insects, but a lot of ants are actually predatory or omnivores. So ants are also really important in ecosystems because they're eating a lot of other stuff. If you were to take those ants out, all of the things that the ants are eating, we might potentially be overrun by those insects. So that's something to think about. Ants are also really important in ecosystems, just in terms of some of the other roles that they do. So most ants, not all ants, but the majority of them nest in the soil or in the leaf litter, but generally a lot of them tend to be on the ground. So, moving the soil around, moving nutrients around, creating sort of spaces for other animals. So in terms of their kind of role in the soil as sort of ecosystem engineers and in nutrient cycling, they're really important. And they've shown, I don't know if this is true in temperate systems, but they've shown in tropical systems that actually, if you take ants out of those soils, the crops there are much less productive. So even once you move away from natural systems and look at agricultural systems where they might be considered pests, actually, if you take ants out of the system, there are a lot of knock-on effects because they have all these other sort of important roles.
And I guess there's a lot we can learn from them as well.
Yes.
Looking at one of my favourite examples, I don't know if it's actually true, but I always tell it because I think it's a cool story. But apparently they were looking at leafcutter ants, and they had the highway where they were going from the nest to the foraging site, and there was a lot of congestion because there was a lot of ants, and then they were measuring the speeds that the ants were going, and they basically found that when it's busier, all the ants go slightly slower, but then the net time it would take all of them as a collective would be shorter, rather than some going really fast and getting there quickly, but then slowing up everyone else. And then based on that, they made an algorithm and then apply that now to traffic management with traffic light signals. So I think things like that, it kind of relates to that biomimetic we were talking about before. But I just think we don't know what we don't know. So that's also other reasons that we should be a bit more appreciative. So we were talking about, there's so much to know about ants and what we do and don't know. And it's kind of fascinating, kind of delving into learning about ourselves through studying ants and so on. Which leads on nicely. You've been involved with some ant research in the past. I wondered if we could hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, okay. I did my PhD on ant-plant interactions. Obviously, I've mentioned interactions before. So that was studying ants on acacia trees in Namibia. And basically looking at, in that case, a mutualism between an ant and a plant. So the ants will defend the trees from either mega herbivores, so things like giraffes and elephants. Potentially, they've been shown to ward off elephants.
Wow, that's cool.
So they'll defend against these mega herbivores, but actually primarily against sort of small insect herbivores that will feed on the tree. So again, the ants will aggressively swarm anything that tries to eat the tree, whether that's a massive giraffe or whether it's some tiny little bug. They don't care. They'll just attack it. So they defend the tree, and then the ants get somewhere to live. So they live inside swollen thorns on these acacia trees. So they have their nests inside there. They also get food in the form of nectar that's secreted through leaves on the tree. So they get somewhere to live and some stuff to eat, and they stop the tree essentially from being eaten. So I did my PhD on that, and then also looking at ant community ecology, so looking at ant communities in deserts, so in the Namib Desert and in Kalahari in the savannah, and looking at basically competition between different ant species and how they go and find food, how they recruit to find food, and then how different kind of strategies that ants have for either securing food sources or for wresting food away from other ants that have already secured the food source. So I did some research on that for my PhD. And then, do you want to know more about that? Okay.
Different species of ant in the same habitat going for the same food source.
Yeah. So ants have different strategies when it comes to foraging for food. So some of them are really good at just finding the food initially. So they will recruit really quickly. They'll find the food. They'll get all of their other workers to also grab the food. But they're not necessarily particularly aggressive. So they can't hold on to that food source. So their strategy is go, grab as much food as possible, and then when some bigger kind of fiercer ants come along, they'll be chased away. So they won't win in a fight, but they're small and they just kind of grab what they can and leave and take it back to the nest.
Supermarket sweep.
Yeah, but exactly. Whereas other ants are, they might be a bit slower. They might have colonies where they don't have as many workers. So it takes them a long time to find a food source. But once they've found it, they're particularly aggressive. So they are able to then, kick off any of the ants that have already found that food and then kind of secure that for themselves. So you can study ants the way that I did this. You put down bait, so you get a bit of card. You put some. I was using, I think, some sort of cat food. I don't know.
Cat food.
It doesn't smell great if you're keeping cat food in the Namib Desert and you don't have a fridge. But anyway, the ants find it quickly. So you put down the food, and then you kind of see who recruits to these different baits. So you can look at which ants are getting there first, how many there are, and then essentially this sort of hierarchy of ants. So who is coming to the food and what those interactions are. So who is more aggressive, who wins in a fight, essentially.
So are there particular traits which align with the different strategies? So are the ones that are defending the resource bigger jaws, or more numbers in the colony or less numbers?
I would say it tends towards lots of smaller ants and larger colonies for the ones that are securing the food initially, and then often larger ants that are coming along and being more kind of aggressive or sort of behaviourally
Big bullies.
dominant. But that isn't always true. Sometimes they surprise you. So there will be little ones that you think are not going to be able to hold their own in a fight, and then they come along. Some of them have really, so there's one genus, Catulicus. They're sort of a medium-sized ant. They don't really, they don't really look like they're going to be particularly aggressive. They just kind of potter along on branches or on the ground, not doing much. But actually, they do really well in fights because they have an incredibly thick cuticle. So they're just like little tanks. So nothing can get them. So even if, they're eating whatever food or they're going along and some other ants come and they, want to get rid of them off a food source, there is nothing you can do to take these ants down because it seems like they just have no weak points. So I've seen an entire, colony of a different species of ants surround these Catulicus and try and, pull her apart. And they can't do it because she's just super tough. She's this little tank going along. So it's not always based on size or, like how big your jaws are and things. There are lots of other characteristics that mean that they're sometimes maybe more aggressive or more able to just kind of do what they like, basically.
So your research was basically just pitching ants against each other in some kind of ant fight club?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And actually, you read a lot of papers when you're doing ant research. So one of the ways that you can tell between different colonies, so sometimes a colony is not, just that one sort of small nest that you see on a ground or on a branch of a tree, because there'll be different, the colonies will sort of bud off and they'll have a number of connected, sort of interconnected nests, and that's all part of one big colony. So you might think, okay, there's a little mound here and a little mound here, that's different colonies, but actually they might all be the same. They've just kind of expanded their house. It's like rooms in a house. So they've just expanded they've put an extension on, basically. So if you want to find out which ants belong to the same colony, one of the tests is they do this kind of gladiatorial combat test. And you take the ant from the one nest and then you take the ant from the other nest that you think may or may not be the same colony, put them in a dish together. If they fight, then they're clearly different colonies because otherwise they would be able to recognize each other, probably through some kind of chemical signaling. So if they fight, okay, then those two nests, they're definitely separate colonies. If they don't fight, then it's likely that they belong to the same colony. So this is a method that ant researchers use, genuinely pitting ants against each other.
Not just to entertain them in lunch breaks.
No. Well, maybe.
Do they bite you when you pick them up, or?
No, so ants have different ways of defending themselves according to which subfamily their ants are in. So some of them will bite you. So a lot of the predatory ones obviously have fairly strong mandibles, so they're pretty good at biting. So there are some ants, these siafu, safari ants that you get in East Africa, and apparently people used to use them as stitches, like before stitches existed, because they are so, once they bite you, and I have been bitten by these actually, once they bite you and they have dug their mandibles into your skin, they just won't let go. There is nothing you can do to get them to let go. So people would use them as stitches because you can get them to bite you, obviously across where there's a wound, and if you then pull the ant away, the rest of the body just pops off and the head is left behind. So some of them have pretty nasty bites. Some of the subfamilies, so ones like the Ponerines, will sting. They have quite big, formidable stings. It hurts a lot to get stung by them. Obviously, there are lots of ants in terms of like the bullet ants. Some of them have particularly horrendous stings. Some of the ants, the Formicines, squirt formic acid. So that's their form of defence.
I saw a cool thing once with that, because obviously wood ants being formicines, they do the same thing. And if the sun's in the right way, you can see it over the nest. Yeah. But also there's a cool trick. If you get a bluebell in the spring and just waft the bluebell over the top of the nest, they squirt the acid and then it leaches out the blue pigment, so then the bluebell turns pink.
Oh, that's really cool.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's.
I'd recommend like listeners to try that, but then don't go picking bluebells. So.
That's true. Yeah, and there's actually there's a species of beetle in Namibia. It might be found in other parts of southern Africa as well. And these beetles eat the ants in order to get the formic acid, and they then use the formic acid as a defense. Yeah, so they kind of use the ants to take on the. I don't know if they then squirt it themselves or if they just taste really bad. I can't remember quite the mechanism for it.
I hope they squirt it because that's cool.
I mean that would be much cooler, wouldn't it? But can't quite remember how it works. But yeah, they eat the ants in order to get the formic acid to then use it for defense themselves. But yeah, so ants have quite a wide range of strategies to defend themselves. So if you know what type of ant it is before you pick it up, then you can prepare against whatever the defense might be. So if you know it stings you, then you make sure you hold it so that it can't sting you. If you know it bites, you make sure you hold it,
Alternatively, if you just want to find out what it is, you could just see what it does.
Yeah, exactly.
Stick your hand in and
just
hope
stick
for the
your
best.
hand in. Has it squirted me with formic acid? Has it stung me? Has it bitten me? Okay. And then you use that as an identification technique.
I should write a field guide.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, but also, I mean, this is one of the characteristics if once you get into the taxonomy and identifying ants, if you put them under the microscope, one of the very first things, not quite the first thing, but almost one of the first things in the key when you're looking at how to identify ants is basically, does it have a big sting? Does it have basically this acidopore? So the acidopore is where they're squirting the formic acid out. Yeah, all of these other characteristics. So because they're so distinctive, and they're associated with each sort of specific subfamily, they're really good ways of telling ants apart. So, yeah.
So they recognise each other by the smell, like
so
hydrocarbons on the cuticle.
Yeah, so there's different. There's a few different behaviours in terms of ant communication. They'll touch antennae with each other, which looks super cute. I know.
Do they do trophallaxis as well?
They do trophallaxis, so which
vomiting into each other's mouths.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah, so that's
also
sort of,
cute.
Yeah. Well, it kind of looks like they're kissing. They are not. They're regurgitating food, but it looks really cute. So maybe this is why they're successful in popular culture, because they're like rubbing each other's antennae and it looks like they're kissing, and actually they're just trying to find out who are they and they're swapping some food.
Do I need to fight?
Yeah, do I need to fight? Also this sort of chemical signalling as well. So what I was going to say is in terms of these combats that they have between the different colonies, obviously ants, if they start encroaching on each other's territories, they might fight each other to kind of secure that area that they're nesting in. One of the reasons that they think invasive ants are so successful, so basically if an ant's been introduced from another country into a different part of its range, so somewhere it wouldn't exist naturally. So some of these really invasive ant species, the reason that they've managed to be so successful is because they seem to be able to form these sort of super colonies where even if reproductively they're not from the same queen, so they're not necessarily related, they won't fight each other. So they're acting as if they're one kind of giant colony. So there isn't some element of competition where the colonies are fighting each other and you only get a limited number of nests. They're acting as the super colony where all of the nests basically, they won't fight each other if you put them together. So they're all working as this like giant super team essentially, and then they just decimate everything else that's there. They take out all of the native ants because they're so incredibly dominant, because they're working as an even bigger force than just one colony. It's loads and loads of colonies together. It's kind of scary. It's ant world domination.
Yeah, do you think that's the future then? There'll be a few global super colonies?
I don't know. That's a scary thought, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, so there are some, so one of the, I can't remember which invasive species it is. There's a few ant species that are really, they're really invasive. Things like the Argentine ant, and one of them, I can't remember which species it is, but it's basically along sort of the coast of Spain and Portugal, along the entire coastline of these two countries. And they've done these tests where they pit ants against each other to see, okay, are they different colonies in sort of a behavioural sense. You could do it with genetics or some other method, but this is like a quick field method. They've pitted them against each other and none of them fight. So essentially across the length of two countries, you have a group of ants that are acting as one colony.
Love wins.
Yeah. Well, it does if you're an ant. Like they're all about teamwork.
Do you have a favourite species of ant? I know it's hard to choose because there's so many and they're all so interesting, but do you have a favourite?
There are so many. I don't know. There's a few ants. So there's one ant that is known. Well, it's a whole genera of ants, but there's a few species, and people refer to them as being teddy bear ants. And these are tetramorium ants. You can go and look them up. Alex Wild, who does amazing insect photographs, but particularly he does a lot of ant photographs. He's got some photos of these ants. We found them when I was on a trip in Uganda, and they really do look like teddy bears. When I talk about ants being cute, and people don't believe me, I show them the photo of this little tetramorium ant. And it's completely kind of round, and it's covered in all this kind of little fluffy, furry hair. It's sort of orangey. It's really super cute. So
That sounds sweet.
I think the teddy bear ants are up there. The other ants that I really like are Melissa tarsus ants. So they basically live under I think that they might be the ones that farm the scale insects, but I'm not sure. But the reason that I think that they're super cute, so they live under the bark on trees, and they live in the little galleries that bark beetles have hollowed out, or just little gaps between the bark and the tree. They live under there. And they're so adapted to living in these tiny, narrow galleries that are running they're running perpendicular up along the tree. So obviously they have 3 pairs of legs, because they're insects. So the first pair of legs is just facing down and forwards, as you would expect. The back pair of legs is doing the same. The middle pair of legs faces the opposite way. So it's facing upwards. So if you can imagine the ant, it's got one pair of legs going down, middle pair of legs going up, back pair of legs going down. And it's because they're always walking through these galleries, it doesn't make sense to just have all of your pairs of legs on one side, because they need to touch both sides of the galleries as they're walking. So it makes sense to have contact.
That is
if you
really
think
cool.
about if you were climbing through a gallery, you would brace your legs and hands on either side of it, and that's essentially what they're doing. So the first time I saw these ants, somebody brought me them in a little petri dish and put them under the microscope, and they had told me about these ants, and they've got these little legs that are pointing in the right direction. So when you take them out of their galleries, it's very cute. They just fall over because they obviously can't walk on normal surfaces because they're so well adapted to being in these little galleries.
That's crazy.
And so I put one of these ants on my little dish. It's still alive. It's on this little dish, and I put it under the microscope, and I looked down the microscope, and I swear this ant was actually waving at me because it just had this spare leg that it didn't know what to do. And somebody told me, no, it's just trying to stand up and crawl around. But I am convinced that this ant was waving at me down the microscope, saying hello. So those ants, I think, have a special place in my heart because they're very cute.
That's 2 excellent suggestions.
Yeah, very, very good.
Yeah, okay, I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you very much for having some ant bants with us.
My pleasure.
If anyone is interested in finding out more about you or your work, where would they find you?
The best thing is to probably Google me to Google Heather Campbell and possibly include Harper Adams in your search as well. So I work as a lecturer in entomology at Harper Adams University. So I teach people lots of things about insects. I try and squeeze in as much information about ants into my lectures as I can. And obviously I'm based out of there now doing my research. So that's probably the easiest way to find me. Otherwise, I'm also on Twitter at Science Heather, so people can follow me there and find out. I'm sure I'll tweet some pictures of cute teddy bear ants so that people can look at them.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, that was a fantastic interview with Heather, and I certainly feel a lot more knowledgeable about ants now, and hopefully you, our listeners, do too. I think that just leaves us to thank our sponsor, the Royal Entomological Society.
That's right, and as always, you can contact us at Antocast.com, or alternatively send us an email at antocast@gmail.com, and then as always Twitter, which we love getting your tweets, so keep sending those into us at Antocast.
Thank you for listening.
And until next time,
Keep collecting. It's too cheesy.
I like it.
actually licked an ant's bum. So, yeah. Oh,
Please tell us more.
raunchy. So the green tree ants, which you get in Australia, but kind of into the tropics, Ecophylla ants. So if you lick their bum, it tastes. That's the technical term. No, it's not. If you lick their bum, it tastes kind of. It's quite zingy. It's a little bit like lime.
Is that an acid?
Almost like licking a battery, because it's acid basically. So, but they use them. So I believe the Aboriginals use them for making kind of like a tea. So they'll collect. So they nest in these big. Yeah, they nest in the tree. They weave these big nests. So that they're really distinctive. You can really easily find their nests. And they have. They basically have these green kind of abdomens. So they're quite distinctive. They're reasonably aggressive as well. They'll sort of swarm out. But yeah, so you can, and you just see them everywhere. If you go up into Australia, into sort of like the tropics, so Queensland and stuff, then you find these ants everywhere, and they're actually delicious. And it doesn't hurt them. You're not killing them. You just pick them up, have a little lick, have a zingy snack, pop them back.
Wow.
Really, it's delicious.